Morning, friends. We are on chapter 27, A Russian Feast. Rakah was crippled, wounded from each side. The punishment was too severe for a prisoner incapable of committing the crime of which she had been accused. The irrigation brooks by the Euphrates had been bombed, as had the main bridges that crossed the river. People kept saying, "These are our city's bridges, not ISIS's." But you could tell that no one outside the city gave a damn. The whole world worried about radicalization, of course. The radicalization that had taken over our minds in our terrorist city, or rather, the radicalization rampant in the minds of foreign fighters exported here from all over the world. The world never wondered whether the radicalization originated from the bombs they and others dropped. I was content enough not to be arrested at any of the few ISIS checkpoints I encountered en route. I appreciated that ISIS had constructed a small bridge on the western side of the Euphrates that kept movement in and out of the city possible. November 2015 was the season of Russian wrath and French etiquette. The Russians visited at midnight, sometimes a minute past. You could always tell that it was a Russian plane from its loud sound, from the wide scale of its destruction, and often from the way it leveled the building next to its original target. In the morning, we speculated about the noise their engines made. Did they make such a racket with their planes and bombs out of pride in their Russian industry, or were their airstrikes a medium of culture exhibitionism, a sort of musical display? The French, it seemed to me, were less successful in creating havoc. Unlike the Russians, their capital had been attacked by ISIS, so they attacked what they supposed was ours. It seemed to me that an eye for an eye was an oddly Abrahamic reaction from such a militantly secular state. Although I couldn't quite figure out in what sense I, a Rockin local, was guilty of bombing a Parisian soccer stadium. Like the Russians, the French were noisy. I could imagine the French abus and ums of the Caliphate considering confessions. The next morning, the bulldozers would be clearing the streets, and I'd be glad the cheap jewelry shop had stayed intact. I climbed through the rubble and peeked over the top and found light in the arcade. I had once worked in the arcade for a whole summer during religious school. I sold trousers and shirts for my boss, a history teacher who squeezed his memory to order me around in Latin. I have no idea what happened to him, since my city had become a capital of care not. I know what happened to his shop. It was the pile of rubble and clothes I was standing near in the aftermath of a night's bombs. Once he had told me I'd have a bright future. The owner of the jewelry shop, my age, was happy to see a customer at such an unexpected time. We were both triumphant. He wrapped my gift in a red satin bag and assured me that it was an adequate piece. Should I tell you the story of an improvised street dance? It's set to the noise of the bombs. You go with the rhythm, matching it with as much excellence as you can. You dodge the shrapnel gracefully. You are judged by continuing to breathe, by staying in one piece. It's a dangerous routine, but its finale is sublime, destiny, and the angels bow and applaud. Dirty and washed out. You give the living technicians and designers, theorists and experimentalists, moralists and villains, all alike, the best middle finger pose of your life. I've been away from home for 4 months. On my way back, I had to reset my brain to Rakah setting. 2 weeks before my return, I had begun nurturing my beard to a length that looked dense and suspiciously long in Turkey, but was daringly short here. I was still getting used to how it itched, and I scratched it often. Luckily, the Islamic State had not yet required that residents shave off their mustaches. I twisted at mine with annoyance, but at least I didn't look like the rockin' fashion plate back then, a Salafi brother with a bald upper lip and a strap of beard scraggle, giving the illusion of a wide jaw. When I sat with those old friends who still remained in Rakah, we bitterly mocked how we looked with these beards growing on our faces. But that did nothing to shorten them. They'd grow and keep growing, just as Salafism had been growing in Rakah in the meantime. Rakah's setting consisted of a number of codes you had to constantly keep in mind in order to survive under Islamic State control. You had no prior education in Sharia. If you had no prior education in Sharia, you'd better start, or else you'd likely end up obliged to take lessons from the Salafi teachers newly installed at local mosques, lessons that required you not only to suffer the indignity of being taught their interpretation of your own religion like a child, but also to miss hours of work. Shave the mustache, let the beards grow, Abu Fatima, the lecturer, said at one of the classes held in the building that had once been Abu Staif's recovery center. Al-Dala had turned it into a mosque that summer. The microphone held so close to his mouth that it was almost shoved inside. He was quoting what he claimed was a well-sourced hadith. It's an order by the Prophet, he assured his audience. I was there looking for an acquaintance who was suffering through his series of Islamic State-mandated classes, and I sat beside him, invisibly in the corner. The lecture series began with an explanation of the Muslim statement of faith. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and ending with an explanation of specific details of the Islamic State's interpretation of Islam, such as the special rules pertaining to women during their menstrual periods. By the time students graduated, they had been indoctrinated in the entirety of the Islamic State's ideology. Some of those attending these classes were little more than boys toiling on their family's farm, or slaving for a pittance in dirty, abusive workshops. To them, joining the Islamic State and becoming lion cubs of the caliphate would seem an alluring prospect. Some adult attendees were there for the $400 voucher the Islamic State would pay upon completion. Others were forced to attend as punishment. These unwilling attendees had been limited at first to lightly punished disobeyers, such as smokers and those who did not close their shops on time before prayers. But the classes soon became requirements for nearly everyone, as the Islamic State used an excuse to preach its ideology to Raqqa residents. To be sentenced to these classes, you could be a poor person who asked for zakat, the money taken from the rich as alms, without first registering with the Islamic State, or a government employee who had studied in regime schools and therefore had, in al-Dallah's words, a non-Islamic education, or a graduate of a secular law school. All were forced to submit to indoctrination. The Sharia lessons were only the latest penalty developed by the Islamic State. Before the summer of 2015, the state would punish lawbreakers by forcing them to dig the trenches that partly encircled the city. It was dangerous work. A number of those conscripted workers ended up dead in air raids. The severity of the Islamic State's punishment seemed to depend completely on the whims of those inflicting them. In one lesson I heard broadcast through the mosque speakers, Abu Fatima sounded particularly angry. "By God the Glorious, not a single smoker will pass my exam and get a voucher that earns him the money of mujahideen," he cried, "nor a cuckold who lets his wife go out unveiled." Hamdan was a Syrian army defector in his 20s who now lived in Raqqa. His long, unkempt beard was deceptive. He despised the Islamic State. My old friend Khalil, a graduate of the University of Aleppo, had been wanting to introduce us to each other, so he invited us both to his house, where we sat in the dark together, smoking. "Are you happy here?" Khalil asked his old friend provokingly after a long conversation, knowing the answer he'd get. "No," Hamdan answered. "Then why don't you leave?" "I won't leave. This is my home. This is my neighborhood," Hamdan said. "They're the ones who have to leave." Khalil had returned from Lebanon about 2 years prior, after he had stopped being able to find work. Al-Dallah now employed him as an accountant in their department of drinking water for a monthly salary of $100. Khalil fell into the gray area between civilian and ISIS member. He called himself a supporter of the group. Although he smoked and chatted occasionally on WhatsApp with friends who were fighters in rebel groups, Khalil was happy with his life under al-Dallah. He saw it as a functioning state that, despite being unable to stop the aerial bombardment of its territory, provided order to his community and others like it. He had recently married. His life, despite all odds, seemed to be moving forward. The core of his dispute with Hamdan lay in the issue of the Islamic State's mistreatment of civilians. Syrian Kurds who had lived in Raqqa their entire lives had been forced out of the city, and Hamdan lamented the fate of his Kurdish acquaintances. Khalil tried to defend ISIS, but stumbled in his attempt. On some points, he justified their actions as necessary for security. On others, he remained silent. The years of friendship between the two men allowed them to preserve a small measure of goodwill, but they parted with uneasiness. Raqqa had not only acquired a worldwide reputation as the heart of terror and the de facto capital of the caliphate, it also reaped special severity at the hands of the Islamic State. This was not Mosul, where people smoked in cafes and sold hats embroidered with the Iraqi flag. The Islamic State had worked hard to isolate Raqqa from the rest of the world. By the time I returned in November 2015, it had removed the Wi-Fi signal extenders placed on the rooftops in order to deprive residents of internet in their homes. On November 18th, satellite internet was banned, and internet cafes were ordered to close. If a cafe wished to reopen, it needed to gather 2 recommendations from Islamic State security forces with their emir signatures. They needed licenses from the Islamic State's intelligence office as well. The Islamic State always claimed that any hardship or new restriction had been brought on by the sins of those afflicted, and the Friday sermon that followed this decision was no exception. People disobey God, and as such, God inflicts upon them suffering, a fighter preached from the pulpit of my neighborhood's mosque. And yet, somehow life went on. Muhammad, 31 and displaced from Aleppo, was preparing to wed his fiancée, as if in private defiance of the incredible challenges the world had thrown at them. Hidden in her home, my cousin's little daughter read a ninth-grade French textbook, trying to understand a single word. Our story went like this. A bunch of Belgian, Dutch, British, and French followers of Baghdadi helped invade Raqqa in the name of the Islamic State, and built what looked like a distinctive form of colonization. They fought locals and usurped their properties. They kidnapped local kids and enslaved, raped, and forcibly married local women. These guys were born in Europe, from European families, and none of them, I could safely say, had ever heard of Raqqa before 2013. Jihadi organizations like Sharia for Belgium and Sharia for UK were still active during the era when European governments were starting to worry about the evolution of the Islamic State. Yet their founders, Fuad Belkacem and Engem Choudhury, remained free. As late as 2014, Choudhury was tweeting openly in support of the Islamic State, calling for jihad from London, at a time when the West was blaming Turkey for not stopping European jihadis' passage into Syria and deeming Syria itself a jihadi holding base. The US-led coalition, which included European countries whose citizens were flying from European airports to play out their jihad fantasies in Syria, was bombing Raqqa. While those jihadi organizations were still active in European cities, sending more and more jihadis to us. This was something ungraspable for me. Frankly, it still is. How were European laws unable to indict homemade jihadi organizations and members, while their governments were so certain that my people in Raqqa collectively deserved doom? They'd sentenced us to death by aerial bombardment. Our charge was terrorism, but the only undeniable truth was that governments brought charges against their own jihadis only when they arrived in Syria. Though many of them were already on the watch lists, yet they somehow flew to Turkey anyway. Should I point out the real victims of terrorism? Should I point out who the terrorists were? They were mainly Europeans and non-Syrian Arab jihadis, and American, European, Russian, and regime military pilots fighting each other in a war that was never ours, but claimed us as its victims all the same. How did we, the locals, exert control over a French jihadi threatening to conquer Paris? A stranger who had done more damage to us than he'd ever done to his country and his people. Yet whenever the jet fighters interrupted, all eyes turned to the sky. Everything here was a target, because the Islamic State was everywhere. But once the bombs had fallen, people went back to what they had been doing. It was no longer a moment of reflection about life and death, nor a moment of curiosity about what had happened. It was something that had no ending. This was Raqqa's setting. Have a good day, friends.